Hi. So I thought I'd do a part two of like a continuation of the Spring Boot course, and here basically, just going to demonstrate how you can start up all of these Java microservices up in a Dockerized environment. The course does a really good job of, of explaining that and helping you, through that process on what it takes to get all this stuff into Docker. One of the things I did in my Docker desktop, I just kind of it was playing around with some of the settings here. I'm setting my memory for Docker to be about 7 GB right here. The instructor itself, he uses 8. I've been able to use 4 in some cases with the smaller services. I also disabled my Kubernetes cluster. I'm doing other projects right now where I have that cluster running, but I disabled it in the interest of memory. So um, let me basically minimize that. And so I'm not going to really go through any of the logic in this microservice, these because I did that in the previous video. But what I did want to demonstrate was, you can run the microservices in the standalone local context right here by using the services tab. But also what's kind of cool is you can go to the, let's see, here you've got like Maven. You can build your Docker containers. Now, let me just kind of quickly show you that, what's going on right here. So for all these microservices, there is a subdirectory under main called Docker, and each one of these will have a corresponding Docker file. So as you can see right here, you've got a corresponding Docker file there too. And I won't really go into the gist or the details of like each of these lines here. Like I said, as the course explains that, and also as there's other really good Docker resources. But basically, it's a two-phase, it's a two-stage process, a two-stage build. And here's the first stage. It's the builder stage, and then so basically, it's setting up your application. It's running, it's running the extract on your jar. It's doing your Maven. Um, so it's actually going ahead and building your image, if you will, from your jar files. And you've already built your jar files too before. And then it's just going ahead and finishing. It's going to the second stage where it actually packages and prepares your image. And you've got an entry point which is going to run the Java JRE against your jar for the most part. And it's setting some other options in here. And he explains what this is needed for. There are times when the application will hang due to a random generator. So he recommended setting this particular setting, if you will. So then here you've got your jar launcher, which is going to load your, launch your application using the Spring framework. So what's kind of nice is we're using a trimmed down version of the JRE because that's one of the conventions when you're building your containers is to make them as lightweight as possible because there is overhead on starting these containers up in the microservices and things of that nature as far as bootstrapping is concerned. So let's see here. So if you go to Maven, what I ended up doing for each one of these is if you go to the Lifecycle, for example, I'll just do it like with one of those. With one of these, if you go to plugins, actually, not Lifecycle, under Docker here, you can see all of your individual steps. You've got like Docker build, you've got, Docker start, you actually have Docker push. I do not have these sets of microservices deployed to a Kubernetes cluster. I did that with another microservices course in .NET, and it's on my blog there, but I won't get into that here. But time permitting, as one of my back burner projects is to take this whole system of microservices and convert the Docker Compose files and put it out there in the Kubernetes cluster. But in order to do that, one way to that I usually do that is push the images up to Docker Hub, you can get by with it with certain Kubernetes settings where you don't have to push the images up to the hub. It'll just go ahead and use it from your local Docker environment. But anyways, I'm diverting. There's other things you can do right here. You can look at your logs and your containers, but let's just go ahead and do a Docker build right here on the inventory service. And as you can see right now, I've just clicked on that particular target, and I'm using the Fabric 8, which is another plugin that you can use, which, you know, there's a whole set of documentation that you can do, you know, that's related to Fabric 8. But you can look at, you know, you can look up information on Fabric 8. It's like you say, here's the website, Fabric8.io. But just know that, you know, for this course, and when you're building your Docker images and stuff like that, it's going to be using a Docker Maven plugin from IO Fabric 8. And as you can see right here, I went through the Docker build steps. I'm not going to push this to my Docker Hub account. I've pushed some of these images up there. Primarily, I would do that, you know, in the Kubernetes cluster case. So now that I built this this image, as a matter of fact, I went and built it for all of the images. So what I can do is just show you. If I just basically say image ls, and then I just do a find dash I ssc, you can see I'm just basically looking at all of the images that I built when I was doing this. You can see I've got beer order service. I got, you know, my snapshot with the latest tag. As you can see, it's the same. Got my beer service, the inventory failover, which is that circuit breaker. Got Eureka, which is the discovery service. Got the configuration service, which again loads all the configuration parameters that at runtime that each of these services can use, so you don't have to store passwords and things like that locally, and you know, you can get it from the remote server. And then of course we got the API gateway. So these images have been built, and now with that particular case right here, so we've built all the images. Now what we're going to do is actually start up. Actually, before I do that, I was going to show you the Docker Compose. So inside, having said that, if we take a look at our main beer service, let's see here. Okay. In our main beer service, we've got, you know, our Docker file. This part's pretty cool, actually. So we got our regular Docker file. This is pretty much the same across the board for all the projects. And then we have two different profiles. We have Docker Compose. I really won't get too much into Docker Compose and what it does, because, but the long and short of it is, it's kind of like a one-stop command that'll start up all of the images that you specify inside of your Compose. It'll spin up all these images. You can do things like depends on, and indicate environment variables that you're passing to. So it's kind of like a, you know, you'll see it's a bootstrapper. So if we take a look, there's two different types of composes. One's local and the other's using logging, which is using Elasticsearch and Kibana, as well as FileBeat, which is kind of like a little application that's going to take all of your logs, and, you know, normally it would like dump it to Logstash, or it could upload it directly to Elasticsearch via a file system, local volume, if you will, inside of Docker. But if we take a look at this Compose logging, this kind of like is our Docker Compose. You'll see that we're using Docker version, you know, 3.3 right here. It's for the schema. And then here you define your individual services. So you can give them, each of your services, a name. So we've got our Elasticsearch service, and we're saying pull this particular image with this tag version. These are the ports, you know, so you've got your ports that you want to redirect from, you know, to the image, as well as, you know, up to from your local host or your current system to the image. So Docker Compose is really good kind of for development purposes if you want to see how things interact. you know, on your development and to do testing, things of that nature. I'm not so sure you can really, it's really recommended to run that in production. For production, you know, it's probably more preferred to use something like Docker Swarm or Kubernetes. Again, I chose not at this time to do the Docker Swarm portion of this course because I'm, you know, pretty much dedicated to Kubernetes and in, you know, just planning on potentially moving these services into a Kubernetes cluster. So I just didn't really do the Docker Swarm part. Uh, and then of course we got like Elasticsearch or Kibana. These are general common images that I did not write. These are out there under Docker Hub. You can do search for file beat. You know, it'll watch your Docker logs and then it'll upload them, ship them up to either Logstash or your Elasticsearch. You know, so that you can view that with Kibana. And then the other thing, when I had mentioned earlier that we were running the Artemis JMS ActiveMQ messaging image, well, here I'm actually putting in the Docker Compose, so you set up your ports right there. Zipkin for distributed tracing. We've got Eureka. So here we're actually pulling in the images that I built, you know, with my last name right here, because these were tagged when we built these images. You know, we specified the tag for these as well based on configuration parameters. Here's where you can actually pass environment variables inside to your containers at runtime. So when they start up, you know, so this is where you can configure things. This is for Docker networking right here, so that, you know, over in the Docker network, when you see you're going to see your individual services images represented by IP addresses. Here's our inventory service. You've got your depends on, which basically says, before you start this up, make sure that these are started up. And of course, you know, we have a whole bunch of environment variables. Restart on failure is basically a restart policy. You can do on failure. You can do, like, if your image should basically die, yeah, didn't do the code completion, but there's like restart policy none, and then there's like restart on failure. So if this image should crash along the way, it's just going to go ahead and restart it, you know, as soon as it can. Kind of like what auto scaling does in the cloud, like AWS, you know, with your launch configurations. So kind of think of this as a launch configuration, and then the restart would almost be like an auto scaling, although that's, you know, it's just making sure that you have minimum number of quote unquote instances running. You know, and then for each of these services, you can elect whether or not you want to process and pass log information, like capture log information and send it to Elasticsearch. Because again, with distributed tracing, you can use a tool like Elasticsearch to report the information to Kibana. And with Kibana, you create indexes within Elasticsearch, and then you can query all of your logs. And that's where Trace ID is really key throughout the system. As messages are being exchanged and stuff like that, you know, you'll have the same tracing IDs, like a span ID, with which basically to track a transaction through all of the services as they occur. So, and then you got your inventory failover, your beer service. And so let me show you something really cool. And then here's our gateway service. Let me start this up. So what you can do inside of here, technically, you could go from the command line and you can type in, you know, Docker compose -f on compose-logging.yaml, and then you can do an up, you know. But IntelliJ kind of makes it pretty nice with this whole Docker plugin kind of Maven thing here with these Docker plugin kind of. You can actually click on the double arrow, and you can just say, I just clicked on it right now. It's going to take a little time, but as you can see, it launched this window right here. So what it's doing down here, and this is going to take a while, but it's actually running this, you know, it's actually doing Docker Compose right now, and it's going through all this. As you can see, it's starting up all of the images into containers. So this is actually going to take a little bit of time to start up because it's got to load for each one of those. It's got to, it's loading that slim JRE, and it's starting up the services. So what I'm going to do is pause this video and then wait until that starts up. So it's still starting up. The services are trying to start up. Now there are some timing issues with Docker Compose. Again, I've had this in other situations where, it may actually start up the containers, but the containers haven't, they're not really in a quote unquote readiness probe state. Like with Kubernetes, you can specify readiness probes where the pods themselves will still be in a not started state if they haven't initialized their database connections or things like that. This is a little bit more primitive. As you can see, we started up the containers, but it's still not quite, ready to go yet. Things are still booting up. But let me show you something here. Okay, so I'm trying to start up Eureka, and I have security on that. It's the standard Netflix password. So if I log in, I'm actually hitting the Docker container right now. And as you can see here, Eureka's started up. Is actually running from the container. And as of this time, there's you got your gateway and your brewery configuration. It's all the configuration options for all the other services, but the individual services themselves still haven't registered themselves properly with the gateway. So that takes a little bit of time. So that's still starting up. So I guess what I'm saying right here, yeah, this is still going. That's the inventory service and the beer service. Like I say, this actually takes time, and you're actually going to have some errors here. So what you can do basically is like you can stop the beer service and like restart it, and then you can stop the inventory service and restart it. There are some timing issues with Docker Compose. You can stop the order service here and restart it. There's probably a timing issue where Eureka wasn't fully ready to take these requests when these other ones were started up. So we just have to kind of restart these until they all start up. Again, this is like for development mode when you're testing out your containers. So what I wanted to mention also is in the main beer service right here, we have under resources, we have this logback spring.xml, and this is kind of like for Kibana and Elasticsearch, and also like for FileBeat, when FileBeat is, because you can opt in for each one of these different containers, and you do that right here where this is where you actually opt into it. You specify labels for each of your services. So when we start up the inventory service, we're just basically saying, hey, we want to collect logs with the FileBeat container, and we want to decode these events to a JSON object, convert it over to JSON, and then send it on over to Elasticsearch. So you can opt into each one of these services, whether or not you want to send events over that way. And when you do, in the main beer service, which is kind of like our main one right there, you can specify formats. So here's a logback Spring XML. So as you can see, again, Spring is all about configuration and conventions. It's kind of like log4j, log4net, all that kind of stuff. You can specify your log patterns, so you can play around with that, and you can specify when this goes to Elasticsearch and you're viewing it in Kibana, you can do different types of formats right there. Whenever an exception occurs, you can specify your stack traces, and here's an appender. It's like a log appender, similar to custom log appenders, but here we're using the regular out of the box console appender, so you can specify rules to exclude messages from certain namespaces and objects inside of there. And then here you can actually format what you're sending from FileBeat on over to Logstash, which we're not using Logstash for the system, but sending it directly to Elasticsearch. So you can specify your pattern here, and then you can index on some of the stuff inside of Elasticsearch, and then you can report on it. So let me bring this back into view. As you can see, when I restarted these other images again, you can see they, as they came on, they actually were able to register themselves with the service discovery, the Eureka server. And if I pull this in right here, it's Postman again. I'm hitting port 9090. This time I'm going against my containers. So as you can see, I'm pulling out the appropriate quantity on hand right there. Let's see here. If we want to take a look at, I think it's customers. So here, there we go. So it's actually hitting the container right now. Trying to see that one. Let's see here. Yeah, well, let's see if we can show the inventory that we have. There we go. So this is actually reaching out and querying across the microservices and to get our inventory right there. So our individual beers, and trying to think if there's anything else that I need to show or would like to show. Yeah, I think like here, if you stop the inventory service, technically it should go ahead and fall back to the failover service like we did before. So as you can see, I went ahead and did a stop. Takes a little bit of time for it to realize that. Let's take a look at this. So if we are on Docker PS, it looks like, yeah, it just took a while. It just wasn't refreshing right here. So I did a Docker PS. I don't see the inventory service running. And if I rerun this command, as you can see, I just ran it. Quantity on hand is back to 0, which is really cool. So it's kicking in the circuit breaker because I stopped the inventory service. So now it's actually kicked over into, as you can see right here, it's actually kicked over into the inventory failover. And if I try to restart this again, it takes a little bit of time to restart that. We'll give it a little bit of time. As you can see, it's trying to start it up again. It's probably not fully initialized. It just takes a little bit of time. So for there, you can just keep refreshing. I'm particularly looking at that quantity on hand. So I'm gonna just give it a little time. I just reran it, and now I'm seeing quantity on hand again. It just took a couple minutes, but what's really kind of cool about that. So the inventory service was responding, but what I think was kind of cool about that, during that time, the failover service itself this is kind of what the failover service runs when you call it all the time. It doesn't even it doesn't even require authentication. It's always going to return this particular value of 0 along with this null beer ID. Basically, it's going to allow your microservices to coexist, atomically, together, not atomically, but they're going to coexist together even if one of the services is down. It's okay to report a 0 quantity on hand, and so you won't be able to fulfill any orders at that time. But I kind of wanted to demonstrate that too. So this is really a kind of a nice utility. You can do, check out your logs. It's really pretty much the same thing as, that plugin, it's pretty much the same thing as, had we done something like, Docker logs on each of these individual containers. Uh, it's the same thing, but it just consolidates. IntelliJ does a really good job there with this. And then, you can look at your environment variables to see what you've got them set up. You can look at your Docker volumes if you have volumes set up, with bindings. And let's see here. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. So this will actually show you your individual properties. So I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. I don't think we, yeah, we actually do have volume bindings. So file beat needs to know there's some Docker volumes in there. It just needs to know where to store that with the images so that it can upload that information over into Elasticsearch and Kibana. So I probably didn't explain that in the right way, but I hope this kind of gives you kind of an idea of what you can do with Docker Compose. Kind of nice here. It'll show you all the images that you currently have inside of your Docker, Docker environment. So it kind of takes a look in there. It'll show you, some of your other containers that you might have. So here's your Compose again, kind of nice. So, and then when you're done with all this, you can just go ahead and stop, or you can say down. And then this is the same thing. As you can see, it's doing a Docker Compose with the YAML file, and then it's doing a down, and it's going to remove, stop your containers, and it's going to, take down your Docker network for this, and you're good to go. And then the process basically is you do more development, and then you can go and run it locally with the services here, and not so much Docker. Run your unit tests. That's the other thing about this course, is that he kind of walks through, you'll be writing, a series of tests here using JUnit and stuff like that, using Mockito, which is, the mocking library, which is really kind of nice too. And also, this will also mock actual hardwired HTTP requests too, things of that nature. So, highly recommended course. I think that's all I have for now, and I thank you for watching, and you have yourself a good one. Bye-bye.